Before we get into any code, let's take a look at the Reveal provider architecture and the lifecycle of events that occur in every Reveal server application. Start with the user context provider. The user context provider is critical to every application. It's really where you hold all of the properties that are required for maybe connection strings, row level security, even what tables a user might be able to see via the object filter. The user context provider gets called on every request from the client to the server and will become sort of that central hub of all of the properties that you need throughout the Reveal application. Every function in Reveal has the user context as its first parameter. So everything in the user context is available to every function. Then we move on to authentication. Authentication is where you are setting up your username, password, bearer token, personal access token based on the data source that you are using. And in the data source itself, you are setting the connection properties like host, database, port, schema, etc. Data source items are optional. However, most likely you will be using the data source items. This is where you would set up custom queries. So for things like a Databricks data source, you might have a custom query. For SQL Server, you might have stored procedures, custom queries, doing ad hoc queries to views. It's all dependent on your data source, what options are available to you. Data source items are key value pair matched from requests on the client, and you'll see that in the demo. Then we have filtering. This is the data source item filter or the object filter. This is where you control what shows up in the data sources dialog. So for example, by default, you'll see every table available in the database. If you want to control that based on a per user, per tenant, etc., you can write code in the data source item filter to control what is listed in the data sources dialog. And then finally, dashboard management is done through the dashboard provider, which has load and save functions, which allow you to control if you're overriding the defaults, for example, because in Reveal, the default is the dashboards folder on the server is where items are saved and loaded from. However, you might want to save to a database. You might want to save to a different folder based on something in the user context. So all of these functions are what gets executed in that Reveal lifecycle on the server. So this will give you an idea of where you're writing code when we get into our Node sample. So let's take a look at that code right now. Here in my Node sample, I've set it up with an additional API on top of the core Reveal API. My Node server is set up with a main.js, which imports the Reveal JavaScript class and the Reveal DOM JavaScript class. If I go to my package.json, you'll see that I have Reveal SDK node installed. I'm on version 1.7.6, and that basically lights up everything I need in this Reveal.js class. In the Reveal DOM library, I have a couple APIs that we'll look at, which give me things like the dashboard file names, the visualizations, etc. This is just to demonstrate how to use that DOM library that we talk a lot about, which gives you additional control over what you can do with a dashboard or dashboards on the server. So in my Reveal.js, we'll start with the user context. So the user context is an optional function, but it's almost required because this is where you're going to set up all of the security context that you use throughout your application. So in my case, when we get to the client side, I'm going to pass a clear xheader1 to the server. That is going to have a user ID and an order ID in it that I'm going to use throughout the custom queries that I have and in other areas. But what I'm also doing is based on my user ID, if it's Blomp, so I'm kind of hard coding this for demonstration purposes, I want to create this admin role. Otherwise, I want to have a user role. And then based on the role, I want an array for allowed tables. I'm going to use these in the data source item filter, which will control my data sources dialog. And then I am doing some other properties in my dictionary object here for my host, HTTP path, access token, schema, database port. All that is required because I'm using Databricks and I'm connecting into a Databricks server. All of those variables are in my .env file, so I'm pulling those in from environment variables. But the end result is I have my user context object, which has my default user ID property, which of course is coming in from my xheader1 in the user ID property. and I have my dictionary object of props that, as I mentioned in the explanation of the lifecycle, the user context is available to every function. So I have the user ID and props in every Reveal function. So what am I going to do next? I'm going to set up my authentication provider and my data source provider so I can just start creating dashboards. So in the authentication provider, I am pulling in the personal access token, which is stored in my environment variables here. And I'm just going to set that to how the authentication works for my Databricks type. In Reveal, when you're writing code in Node, .NET, Java, the only variable really is the type of data source. And then that might have, like I mentioned, different connection properties, etc. So for example, I have maybe MongoDB, Postgres, and Databricks in my backend. I might have multiple different connection settings and properties here based on the data source type that I'm using. I also, maybe based on the user context, might be pulling in different connection properties per user. So how you use the user context and the data source is really up to you. This is the simplest implementation, a single data source, and I'm using the access token for my credentials. And then for the data source provider, I mentioned before that Databricks has a handful of different properties: host, HTTP path, schema, database, and port. I'm setting those. It's returning the data source to the client, and now I am done. So with these two items and my user context provider, I'm ready to go. I can start creating dashboards. So I am running my server. I did my node main, and this is running on port 5111. So let's take a look at how to create a dashboard. So on the client side, I have an HTML page here, index.ds.html. I have my three dependencies: jQuery, Day.js, and the Reveal JavaScript library. This is on the CDN. When you do a POC with Reveal, you can download the TypeScript, the JavaScript, and all the language packs locally, so you get all that good stuff. I'm going to load my dashboard into this div called Viewer, and you'll see here that I'm creating something called the Reveal View based on an API in Reveal called ig.revealView is Viewer. So I've got this object. I'm telling it where my server is, which is running at localhost 5111, and I want this to start in edit mode. So when you are creating dashboards or allowing users to edit dashboards, you control that data sources dialog. You do that through the on data sources requested. In this case, I'm just telling it that I'm using a Databricks data source. I have an ID, and I am giving it a simple title. When a user clicks on this item from the data sources dialog, a callback goes to the server. I'm passing this item to the server, and then it's going through the life cycle of events here to return what the user expects. So in this case, I view this in the browser. My browser comes up. Let's go ahead and create a new visualization. Here we're in the entry point. We started in edit mode. There's my Northwind Databricks data. We'll click that. The callback goes to the server. The list of tables that I'm allowed to see come up. If you recall, in our user context provider, we had this allowed tables or filtered tables array. I've got my customers, invoices, order details, orders, etc. I can preview data, which will show up in a preview window here, so I can kind of see what's going on. If I want to now create a dashboard or a visualization, let's go ahead and select invoices. I'll click select data, and we end up in the visualization editor. So now this is just that simple WYSIWYG. So let's do order date, and let's do freight by date. This goes off to the server, executes this query in the Databricks server that was generated by the Reveal server, and it brings back that aggregate data. We can do things like add a fixed line. Maybe I want to see the average of freight across all of my years. If I want to modify the properties of the freight value, I can do that. So in this case, I'll enter an axis title. We'll say total freight. We'll leave it at sum. For formatting, we'll make this a currency. We'll use large number formatting to clean up this y-axis. I'll check the box and update the field. That looks pretty good. I want to change my fixed line as well. I want it to pop a little bit. So let's change it to like an orangish color or gold. I want my line style to be dotted. And I also want to use currency and large number formatting. Update that line, and you can see it looks a little bit nicer there. Let's go to settings. I want to uncheck show legend. I want to show my axis lines, and let's show axis titles as well. So there's my total freight, and we'll just call this freight by date. And I'm going to check this box, and there I'm on my way to a new dashboard. We'll just call this one freight analysis. And I'm going to duplicate this visualization. I'm going to edit it, and let's do something a little bit cooler. Why don't we grab a map? So I'll do a choropleth map. And for the map itself, let's use our world countries map. For the location, let's find the country field, and let's do ship country. So that is the freight by ship country. So we'll say freight by ship country. And that looks good to me. We'll check the box, freight analysis, and I'm going to check the box. And what that's going to do is automatically save to the dashboards folder on the server. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's look in our dashboards folder, and there's freight analysis.r-. So that automatically saved. Now, if I go back to this view and I hit refresh, I'm going to go right back to the new dashboard screen. I want to load that dashboard now. So let's take a look at that API for loading a dashboard. I'm going to scroll down a bit. There's a bunch of stuff on this page because you'll see there's actually a select that lets me choose the dashboard to load. But the idea here is that I am calling the Reveal Load Dashboard API. I'm passing it in the name of the dashboard that I want to load, and I'm assigning it to the Reveal view. So to load a dashboard is usually about 3 lines of code. If I right-click, open this up in the default browser, we'll see that freight analysis is the first item in my list, and there is my freight analysis dashboard. And of course, I can go to the overflow, jump into edit mode, do whatever I want here because I am viewing, but editing is also available. I had some other dashboards on the server, so you can see that these guys are all available and they load up nicely. And keep in mind, this is live connection to my Databricks server. So let's go ahead and close that and look at a little bit more advanced capability that we talked about, which was that data source item provider. So again, the data source item provider allows you to do custom things like a custom query based on maybe an incoming request from the client. So here I'm checking the data source item.id request from the client, where if it's customer invoices, I want to do a select star based on the user ID, which is coming in from my user context.user ID. So this is a row level security query. If the data source item ID is all invoices, then I just want to set the table to invoices. So you can check for a table name or an ID, you can set a table name, etc., or you can set a custom query. And then I'm also using those allowed tables to determine what a user should see when a query is executing. So I say if the data source item table is part of allowed tables, then I want to use the table as a parameter if they're a user role. Otherwise, I want to use the same table parameter, but I don't want to use a where clause. So for example, we know that BLOM-P is going to be an admin role. There's a bunch of tables they're allowed to see, but if it's not a BLOM-P role, that means they're a user. I want this where clause. But if they are BLOM-P, they can see whatever they want. And then I'm going to use the user context in the data source item filter, and I'm using those same allowed tables as well. So I'm checking that there are allowed tables, and then I'm just going to let whatever the allowed tables are for this particular user role to pass through into the data sources dialog. I will return only what this person should be seeing based on user or admin. And if we scroll back up, what was that? If they were admin, they can see these tables. If they're user, they can see these tables. And again, this information is all triggered from my header. So how am I passing this? Let's go to indexdsi.html. Indexdsi.html has a couple selects that have a order ID or a user ID. And that user ID, of course, is triggering everything. You can see BLOM-P and some others that I have. This is doing the same thing as indexds.html. I have my dependencies. I have my Reveal view. I have my base URL for where my server is at. But there is something new here. So I'm using the set additional headers provider to send whatever is in this headers array to the user context provider on the server. So I'm going to pass this information. In my case, it's just going to be this clear X header 1. You might pass your token or other important information to that user context provider through set additional headers provider to act on it on the server. So in my on data sources requested, I'm setting the header based on selected values from my selects, and I'm logging this just so we can see what it looks like. And then I have the same data source that I set up in the previous HTML example, but I have two new items here. These are data source items. So I've got my all invoices ID and my customer invoices ID, and they each have a title. So remember, all invoices ID, if I go back to my server and we look at our data source item, if I see all invoices, I just want to pass back the invoices table. If I see customer invoices, I want to send back a query with the user ID. So customer invoices. So let's go back to index.dsi, customer invoices. Now on the callback, there's two arrays here. The first array is the data source. The second array is the data source items. And you have a parameter here, which is true or false. This will indicate whether the data sources dialog should show what's being used in a particular dashboard or not. I usually set that to false. So let's right click, view this in the browser. I have my selects up here. We're going to log in as Alfkey. I'm going to click plus visualization. I have my three items here. So let's go ahead and just do selected customer invoices. This goes off and does that custom query on the server. And to make sure that we only did that custom query and picked up Alfkey, let's change this to a grid. Let's drag customer ID. And you can see I only have Alfkey here. There's only one page in my grid. And if we grab the order IDs, we can see that there's Alfkey and those are each one of their orders. So let's close this out and let's log in as BlomP. Plus visualization, same thing. And again, we're doing a row level filter here. So we should still only see the customer IDs BlomP. So there's our BlomP. And if we grab the order IDs, we'll see the BlomP order IDs. So let's close this out. We'll discard this. And let's take a look at our data sources now. So let's click My Databricks. And remember, this has the filtered or allowed tables for BlomP, which is the role admin. So I've got customers, invoices, etc. Let's close that out. Let's log in as Alfkey, plus visualization, My Databricks, and we should only see customers and orders. So that's correct. But also on customers, we should only see Alfkey rows. So let's preview this data. And you can see that only Alfkey shows up because on the server, if we go back to our Reveal.js, we said, well, if they're in the allowed tables and they're a user, then only do this parameterized table with this parameterized user ID. So we're forcing only to see that. Otherwise, we should see everything. So let's go ahead, close this, log in as BlomP, plus visualization, plus My Databricks. Let's view customers, and we see everything here. So very simple, very straightforward. My entire server, let's scroll all the way down, and this includes the dashboard provider and the dashboard storage provider, which I'm not using. Is around 162 lines of code. Now, I did mention I have these APIs, which I've added some Swagger for, swagger.json, but this will give you the dashboards, the dashboard names, and here, if we scroll, we have dashboard names. What this is doing is actually pulling out the name and the title of the dashboard, because the title and the name could be different. So if we go back here to load dashboard, and I'm going to view this in the browser, and I'm looking at freight analysis, I want to edit this, and let's call this freight analysis dashboard, ORD, and let's check this box. Okay, so now it's freight analysis dashboard. Let's hit refresh. So there's freight analysis dashboard, that's all I have in my list. But on the server, it's still called freight analysis.r-. We don't overwrite the name of the file. We just update the title. So that's where pulling out the dashboard title as well as the file name becomes important. And then I have a check here. If you want to delete a dashboard or overwrite, you can check if it exists. And then finally, I'm using, again, the TypeScript DOM to pull out all of the visualization info for each dashboard on my server. So if we go to localhost 5111 API docs, these are the 4 APIs. This is just a list of the file names. As you can see, we've got a few file names here. These are the dashboard names. So let's execute this. I've got the dashboard file name, and the actual dashboard title. So you can see here, freight analysis dashboard, which we saw earlier, exists. We won't mess with that. But how do we get all the visualizations from each dashboard? And you can see I've got the file name, the title, the viz ID, freight by date, the visualization type, column, core, pleth, etc., and then, of course, the image type to use. If I go to my Acme Analytics demo and we go to the Viz catalog, that is exactly the information displayed here. And then with some additional API, it is what is pulling in the single visualization view. So that is an end-to-end on the Node server setup, an explanation of the lifecycle of Reveal and all of the information that you really need to set up a great server experience. And in fact, on my client, a lot of my CSS and everything is in a separate file, but I just have this quick example here of all of the dashboards that are on the server, pulling in data. I've got my data sources, so I can just do exactly what we were doing before, and then my dynamic data sources here. And of course, there is a ton more that you can do with Reveal. Take a look at our YouTube channel, our docs, and our GitHub repos.